Hi, I'm Finn, and in this Sociology Explained video, I'm going to be going through educational policies, particularly in relation to marketisation. So it's the final part of the AQA A Level Sociology education topic, which is in paper 1, and the notes that I'll be using in the final part of the notes are available on the Sociology Explained website. So if you find the video helpful and these notes helpful, go over to the website to have a look at those notes. So as a sort of introduction to what marketisation is, it's generally a movement within education along with other areas of life or part of society, where education and schools have begun acting more like businesses, and that's been driven through policies by the government, particularly following the Education Reform Act of 1988. And it's shifted the way that admissions work, the way that funding works, and the way that performance between schools is measured. And sociologists have responded to this change in various ways, some seeing it as a good thing and as increasing equality of opportunity and sort of driving up the quality of education, while others have seen it as being detrimental to education and particularly disadvantaging certain groups. So within these notes also, while I talk about marketisation, I'll also talk you through some policies that came sort of at the same time or through the same movement as marketisation, but were more explicitly aimed at widening equality of opportunity. And it's important to know those policies as well, because you can use them in an essay. If an essay asks you broadly about the impact of policy, it might be important not just to talk about marketisation policies and not just to criticise the effects of those policies on education, but to also bring in some policy that's had a positive impact, and to think about different types of policies. So the first key concept here is open enrollment. So open enrollment is a policy particularly associated with the Margaret Thatcher government, and this was essentially a policy that was designed to give parents more choice over the school that they sent their child to. A key definition as we go through here will be parentocracy, which is a sociological term that we'll talk about later, but this is essentially a system where parents have powers to choose schools, and they become like consumers in a market, sort of shopping for schools. And this represents a shift in control from the state allocating the school that your child goes to parents choosing where their child goes to. So the key policy here is the Education Reform Act of 1988, which introduced open enrollment, which meant that parents had the right to apply to any school or any state school in the country, not just the one that was closest to their home. So before that, children just had to go to their local comprehensive school, or they could at some point go to other schools like grammar schools. Parents could pick up to 6 schools, depending on their local authority, and then they were able to get into the school or perhaps not get into the school, which depended on things like catchment area, whether siblings were at the school, and other kind of needs of the student. So this was brought in by the Margaret Thatcher government, believing that if parents had the choice, had the ability to choose the school freely, that meant that schools would have to work harder to win parents to apply to their school, which in theory would raise the standards of teaching at the school because they'd want to impress parents and get them to apply. A key scholar in relation to this is Ball and Ray, and they have been critical of open enrollment, suggesting that market-style reforms like this, so reforms that make education operate like a market, have created a parentocracy, they call it, as we discussed before, that advantages predominantly middle-class and upper-middle-class parents. They say that parents who have more wealth and time and confidence tend to have more freedom about when it comes to choosing schools. Middle-class parents were more easily able to decode admissions procedures, research league tables, and also they were more economically mobile, so they're able to move to areas that have better schools in them more quickly. And they were also able to use social networks, so knowing a head teacher, etc., in a way to help get their student in. So they argued therefore that open enrollment wasn't equally beneficial to students, but instead it advantaged middle class students, while it also disadvantaged working class students who had parents who didn't have as much time to attend meetings, do this research, and they also didn't have the money to move house easily to get into a good catchment area. Also, they suggested that even some schools kind of brand themselves as middle class. So even when working class parents do have the time to research, sometimes they feel out of place in this school that's not trying to attract them with the way it speaks and the way it presents itself. So you can see here this little table that will talk to you about the impact that open enrollment has had in a kind of contemporary context. And you can see that in some ways open enrollment does work because 83.5% of students do receive an offer from their first preference school. So that suggests that most students are able to get into the school that they want or that their parents want. So it has given that increased freedom. And over 96% receive an offer from at least one of their first preference schools. So even if it's not the number one, it'll be one of the preference schools anyway. But of course, this is very regionally diverse. In more rural areas like Cornwall, Northumberland and Bedfordshire, over 98% will get their first choice school, whereas in Hammersmith and Fulham, around 25% will not get their top school. So that shows that this is not a sort of nationally united data set, kind of. However, there's also data that kind of backs up Ball and Ray's argument that different parents making different use of open enrollment, with the 2018 Education Policy Institute finding that 1 in 3 families only express one preference for schools. So this suggests that they're probably not really weighing up all of their options and making these careful, detailed decisions, but they're just picking one school, perhaps their local school. And this is most likely to be white British families who are likely already to have low levels of attainment. And 17% of families select a school to be their first choice school that has a less than good Ofsted rating. So that suggests that even though they're choosing, they're not in the same way making the most of the data that's available, Ofsted and league tables, etc. And this group does this in spite of the fact that many of them, 27%, do it even if they do have an Ofsted good or outstanding school in the area. So it really shows that they're not necessarily using the data available. So that leads on to the next kind of key concept, which is about Ofsted and league tables. So this is obviously, you're probably aware what Ofsted is. They inspect your school. And league tables are kind of introduced, so that's a table where you can see the performance of all of the schools in an area. It includes things like exam results, behaviour and management, and it's publicly available to all people to look at. And this again was brought in by the Education Reform Act of 1988. So what this act did is it introduced further standardised testing and public league tables. This meant that all students across schools were kind of tested on the same ground. And assessments were brought in at a younger age 7, 11 and 14, so then progress could be measured as well, and this would be published in league tables. And of course this data became very linked to how successful a school was, and it was very obviously publicly visible. So again, this was introduced with the thinking that because this was being made publicly available, it would force schools to kind of do better to ensure that they performed well on league tables and that they were able to attract students and maintain a good reputation. Another key policy that made Ofsted and league tables happen is the Education Schools Act of 1992. So that first act created league tables, but this act in 1992 created Ofsted. So Ofsted is the Office for Standards in Education, and it's an independent body that is responsible basically for regulating schools across England. So it carries out sort of a series of standardised inspections across schools that tests things like teaching quality, leadership and management, along with kind of behaviour, safeguarding and academic things as well. And it gives one-word judgments to schools, so you can either get or one word or 2 words. You can get not good or in need of improvement or good or outstanding, maybe some others as well. But essentially they give these very quite straightforward, meant to be maybe accessible judgments on a school based on their inspections. So again, this was introduced in the idea that it would force schools to try and do better because they're going to be inspected, and also the idea that it would make schools more accountable and transparent. They weren't just sort of answerable to themselves and students, but they were now being officially inspected and made to kind of meet some sort of regulation. An interesting story about Ofsted in recent years is the death of the head teacher Ruth Perry in 2023. So Ruth Perry was a head teacher who was at a school who was recently downgraded from outstanding to inadequate, which is obviously one of the lower ratings you can get in an Ofsted inspection. And then she unfortunately died by suicide. So that meant that Ofsted garnered a lot of criticism for being sort of overly simplistic and placing too much pressure on teachers and on schools with its sort of one-word labelling of schools, essentially. Then you also have the 2013 Secondary School Accountability Consultation. So this introduced the English Baccalaureate and Progress 8. So Progress 8 was essentially a new way of measuring schools and student achievement. So rather than just measuring them sort of at the end of their school year, so based on things like GCSEs, they now were measured across 8 subjects, across 8 GCSE subjects, from all the way from primary school age all the way to 16, not just from their sort of raw achievement at the end. So the idea of this, again, was that it would mean that students were being tested more kind of holistically and on their progress, and that schools weren't being judged just on their results, but on how well they were able to help your child improve, not just their sort of end result. So this was brought in due to concern that schools were essentially trying to pick students who were going to get better results so that it would drive up their performance on league tables and stuff. So this meant that instead all students kind of were meant to become equally valuable to a school if they could get those students to improve. So key scholars in relation to Ofsted and league tables are Will Bartlett is one of them. So he argues that because of league tables and Ofsted, schools who perform well in those things get oversubscribed by lots of parents want their child to go to that school, so they kind of have the power in that situation to choose who they accept into their school. And once they have that power, they will do what he calls cream skimming and silt shifting. So this is the process by which they will try to attract. The cream skimming part is where they're trying to take the best students in, students who they believe will be well behaved and have high progress and performance outcomes. These students will tend to be socially advantaged middle class students. Whereas at the same time, they'll do what he calls silt shifting, which is where they try to discourage students who seem like they may have behavioural problems, students who they may have maybe special educational needs or weaker levels of attainment, and they will then be redirected to lower performing schools. So this obviously creates an ongoing pattern of achievement problems, and this will have obviously clear class and probably racial and other dynamics to it. A scholar that supports this policy change, though, that supports Ofsted and league tables, is Eric Hanushek, who writes about how accountability systems, he calls them, so things like Ofsted and league tables, along with performance data, public reporting, he says this makes schools responsible for the outcomes of students, and he says that it makes a sort of public incentive to improve teaching and the quality of teaching, and also to help drive up student achievement. So he argues that this sort of public and public data, etc., is good for improving transparency and improving schools. But you could also criticise policies. If you couldn't think of someone like Will Bartlett in the exam, you could also criticise them in a few other ways, like these criticisms here, which are that, for example, Ofsted may encourage schools to focus less on things like student welfare and focus more on things like numbers and results. You could also argue, obviously, that single word judgments that Ofsted offers, like inadequate, are obviously overly simplistic and don't reflect the kind of nuance of the school or what else the school is doing. You could also, of course, argue that schools are able to quickly improve how well they're doing when an Ofsted inspector is coming, which means that these Ofsted inspections won't reflect truly how good a school is. The next key concept is education as a business. So this is essentially the idea that schools are made to compete for students, for funding, and for reputation, and they act like businesses competing for customers. So a key policy here, again, is part of the Education Act of 1988, particularly in relation to the funding formula part of the Act. So the Act of 1988 introduced a funding formula, which is where school budgets, so how much money they were allocated, was linked directly to the number of pupils that they had applying each year, rather than being allocated by the local authority alone. So this gave schools a financial incentive to attract more students. So this is really a key way in which schools became like businesses, because like a business, the more customers they got, the more money they got. Not necessarily more difficult students, etc., or the more testing demands that they needed, etc., the more money they would get. But it was just about the number of students you get in, the more money you get. So students really became seen like customers at a business. So again, this was kind of driven by a few things in the Thatcher government. It was partly about, again, trying to make schools more accountable and believing that if they behaved like businesses, they would have to keep their quality high. They needed that money, so it forced them to teach better and to attract more students like a business. But it was also kind of aligned with a general sort of movement away from the state or the government controlling things and giving more power to schools or to local businesses, which was something that was happening a lot at the time. Another key act in relation to this was the Education Act of 1993, which was the Specialist Schools Programme. So this was introduced by the John Major Conservative government, which essentially allowed certain secondary schools to apply for specialist status in particular subjects, so something like technology or languages or arts. They could be a technology school, they could be a languages school. And this meant that they could receive specialised status that gave them additional funding and therefore encouraged them to develop a particular focus on that thing, which again kind of demonstrates a way that schools were being less treated as kind of equal by the state, and better schools or specialist schools could compete in a different way to get more money. So once again, it's how a business might specialise in an area of the market to capitalise on its on the money that can be made there. Again, the idea of this policy was that it would encourage schools to find their specialism and to be really good at it, which ideally would drive up the quality. But also it was part of the desire of this was to increase the diversity of offering for schools, so to give parents more choice, because some schools would be specialist schools. If they really wanted their child to be good at technology, they would know to send their child to that school. And this was expanded by the new Labour government with the School Standards and Framework Act of 1998, which allowed specialist schools even more choice to select up to 10% of students by how good they were at the school's specialism. And this could, of course, then win them even more of that money. You then have the importance of teaching white paper in 2010, which is the idea of pupil premium. This was a similar policy, but it was designed slightly differently. So this was a policy where additional money could be gained by schools for students from disadvantaged backgrounds in their schools, particularly those who students were in care, particularly, or those eligible for free school meals. And this would operate in addition to the funding formula, meaning that schools who had more disadvantaged pupils could get more money. But schools did have kind of ultimately discretion over how this money was spent, which is of course something that people have criticised. So this was designed as a way to sort of counter some of the negative effects of the funding formula, which were that only the schools kind of who were doing the best would get the most money. And this was designed to support those schools that were slightly worse performing, that might need more money because of things like extra students who have extra needs. You then have the Academies Act of 2010, and this was introduced by the Conservative Lib Dem coalition government, and this was a government that expanded the academy programme to allow all maintained schools, high-performing schools particularly, to convert to academies. And if schools became academies, they were removed from local authority control, and they kind of operated as their own sort of trust in a way. And they would then have greater autonomy over the budgets, curriculum design, staffing and school hours. And a lot of these academies would rely on local businesses for sponsorships. Also charities, universities and faith organisations could invest. So once again, sort of reducing the control of local authorities or the government, and giving more power to sort of business and schools themselves. So once again, this was kind of introduced with the belief that once schools were free from regulation of local authorities, they would do better. And business sponsorship, it was thought, could bring in some expertise to schools and drive innovation. A key scholar in relation to all of this is Alex Molnar, 2005, who wrote about how education in this time was increasingly shifting from a public, good-serving, sort of democratic institution to something that was a sort of marketized, private commodity shaped by commercial interests. So he would look at something like corporate sponsorship of a school and advertising in schools as a way of letting businesses control what schools are doing, rather than a sort of democratically elected government deciding what schools should be doing. So he says that when schools are increasingly serving businesses, they may favour things that are about profit, branding and relationships with business, even if that doesn't advantage the students themselves. So this risks turning schools into businesses and not institutions designed to help young people. So scholars, other kind of key scholars you could bring up here, Chubb and Moe, obviously well-known new right scholars, are a big advocate of this kind of policy, who believe that market principles are really important in driving competition and encouraging innovation. And when schools are competing, they have to perform better. They say that once schools are operating autonomously and without kind of control by a local authority, they become more accountable to parents and to the needs of students, and not just to the local authority. So they would argue that they become more directly accountable. Once students are customers, they say, like a business is accountable to its customer, they say schools become accountable to the students, which they say, of course, is what schools should be. Some other criticisms you could bring in of these policies, you could say that schools, when they start acting like businesses, sort of prioritise marketing and how they look compared to how they generally are, and how students are genuinely feeling and how they are learning. So they're just focused on the sort of outward appearance of it that they can do in order to sort of garner sponsorship from businesses, etc. You could also say that when schools are competing against each other, It discourages kind of collaboration between schools, which could be a really good way of helping students. And you could also say that when schools are being made to act kind of like efficient businesses, this may lead to them doing things like cost cutting. As many businesses try to cut their costs, if schools do the same thing, that could really disadvantage students, particularly those students who need that extra support. Another key scholar you could kind of bring in if you wanted to drive your grade up here is Stephen Ball, 2003, who argues about how market-style reforms encourage schools to behave sort of strategically, focusing on their performance data rather than prioritising equitable education. So once they focus on selecting desirable pupils, as Bartlett spoke about, or exam results and how they look, this will broaden the inequality between schools, because schools will not have an incentive to help all students, but they'll only have an incentive to sort of win in this business-like competition. So alongside these policies, I'm going to quickly run through some other policies that came sort of particularly in the New Labour era. So that's kind of from 1997 onwards, that were designed to reduce the kind of bad that marketisation was doing. However, it's worth saying that New Labour was a sort of a government that was largely in favour of marketisation and did continue marketisation, but they also sort of passed these policies alongside traditional marketisation policies in a way to alleviate some of the negative effects of marketisation. The first policy there is Sure Start, which was introduced in 1998. So this was a policy where sort of centres were set up in local communities focused on children aged 0 to 4, and the idea was that these young people would be given extra support, health services and childcare, all for free, in the hope that this would reduce the kind of inequality between students before they started school. So the idea was that this would give children from disadvantaged backgrounds and with less perhaps stable home lives more of a chance when they got to school, and hopefully narrow the attainment gap there. You also have education action zones introduced in 1998. So this was a policy set up to give certain schools additional funding if they were in particularly deprived areas. But in the sort of marketisation way, private finance initiative, it's called a PFI, which is essentially where disadvantaged schools could gain extra funding to help their students, but it was gained through a partnership with a business, particularly kind of a local successful business in the area or another big business. So of course the aim of this once more was to sort of raise the standards in those schools with support of local business money. You then have the Education Maintenance Allowance of 2004. So this was a policy that would have students from low income families aged 16 to 19, if they decided to stay in education after 16, they could receive a weekly payment for doing so, which was designed to encourage these students from low income families to have an incentive to stay in school rather than just to leave and get a job, which once more was to hope to increase the kind of educational levels of people from low income families. So it's worth reflecting on how well these policies have lasted. After 2010, funding for Sure Start reduced significantly, and most centres have now been closed since Conservative austerity measures. And in 2011, the Education Maintenance Allowance was scrapped and replaced with a smaller kind of bursary scheme, and education action zones have sort of gradually been phased out and didn't really take off particularly. So the key scholar behind these changes was Anthony Giddens, who wrote The Third Way and advocated for the third way in education. So he was a kind of key advisor to Tony Blair and the New Labour government, and he argued that in a sort of marketisation style, he agreed that state control of education was ineffective, and he said that there was going to be a benefit to competition and to marketisation, and that it would increase standards of teaching. But he also argued that the state should do something to ensure that this is definitely promoting equality of opportunity in education and make businesses responsible to communities. So that's the kind of thinking behind some of those policies there. So the final key concept here is vocationalisation. So this is a way in which marketisation policies and certain policies have made education arguably more vocational, which means more skills-based and more clearly setting people up for employment. So here you could talk about the Youth Training Scheme, which was introduced in 1983 by Thatcher's government, which essentially provided work-based training for 16 to 18-year-olds who were not in full-time education. It offered placements ranging from 13 weeks to 2 years, kind of doing job experience, which of course the idea was that this would deal somewhat with youth unemployment, which was high at the time, particularly following deindustrialisation, and big changes in the economy that meant lots of people didn't know kind of what career they'd be doing. And it sort of more closely linked education and how education was working with the needs of the economy and the needs of businesses. You then also have the post-16 skills plan, which was introduced in 2016, which was introduced by David Cameron's government and then implemented by Theresa May's government. And this introduced T-levels, which were kind of 3-year level 3, so the equivalent of A-level qualifications, designed to kind of combine traditional kind of classroom learning with vocational industry placement learning. And this would give people very technical training for specific career paths. And this followed the Sainsbury's Review 2016 that found there was a lack of preparation for many young people for the labour market. And essentially it was designed to encourage students or to increase the sort of interest in more vocational routes and raise the credibility of vocational education and particularly give working class students that opportunity where previously it was often deemed sort of inferior. So you can see here a bit of data on how that's turned out. So 2024 to 2025, there were over 300,000 apprenticeships start in England and over 700,000 people participated in apprenticeships. Apprenticeships make up made up around 3% of the workforce totally. And they're particularly focused in jobs like construction, education, early years education, health and science. Worth noting, you can have a look online, since T-levels very recently under the current Labour government, there have been introduced V-levels, I think they're called. So that's something we're also looking at, which is similar vocational training. So that's something you could bring into your essays as well to be extra kind of contemporary. So have a look at V-levels as well, I'd recommend. So scholars to think about in relation to this are Ken Roberts, 2025, who supports vocationalisation, who argues that this provides sort of structured pathways into employment, particularly in modern labour markets where it's difficult to easily transition from education to work. And he says that this highly technical training helps young people develop practical skills that will give them a career direction. However, you could also say that often vocational routes are seen as sort of lower status, particularly amongst middle-class students who are less likely to choose vocational routes. So this could arguably reinforce kind of class dynamics where working-class people go into vocational careers, whereas middle-class people take the more academic route. And the availability of vocational apprenticeships is very regionally unequal. It's not kind of nationally the same. You can always get one. It depends where you are and what businesses are in the area, etc. So there's unequal access there to these pathways. A kind of key scholar who criticises this is Dan Finn, who argues that the government and education training policies, while they sort of try, they fail ultimately to match the realities of the changing labour market, particularly following the decline of traditional industrial employment and raising the leaving age of school. So he says that schools still continue to prioritise traditional academic knowledge over sort of meaningful vocational skills. And that many students, particularly those from working class backgrounds, leave school then feeling ill-prepared for working life and for employment, and often struggling to secure employment, and that these policies are sort of like putting a plaster over a much bigger problem. And he says that also youth training schemes often are paid quite poorly, which means that young working class people often just find themselves in poorly paid positions that are sort of marketed to them as very vocational or career driven, but largely it will lead to sort of a low wages and less of a secure career. So that's all the key information you need to know for marketisation policies. Obviously also looking there at vocationalisation and policies to reduce equality of opportunity. So as I said, if you found that helpful, go and have a look at those notes that are on the Sociology Explained website, where you can also see our essay plans. We have essay plans particularly on this topic and on the globalisation topic, which I know a lot of people struggle with, so it's a helpful one to go and look at, particularly how you could use that in an exam.